Welcome, weary wanderer, to a journey through the hidden mysteries and forgotten secrets of Hyrule. Tonight, we explore the deepest theories that dwell in the shadows of the Zelda universe, those whispered possibilities that dance at the edges of canon and speculation. These are tales of duplicate master swords and abandoned timelines, of heroes' forgotten fates and civilizations transformed by the passage of ages. So settle into comfortable darkness, let your mind drift among these contemplative mysteries, and allow yourself to ponder the infinite possibilities that lie beneath the surface of Hyrule's legendary tales. Close your eyes, and let us begin. In the deepest chambers of the Temple of Time, where ancient stones have witnessed the turning of ages and the rise and fall of heroes beyond counting, there rests a truth so profound and unsettling that it challenges everything we think we know about the most sacred weapon in all of Hyrule's long history. The Master Sword, that legendary blade forged in divine fire and tempered with the goddess's own blessing, may not be the singular, eternal weapon of legend that stories have made it seem. Consider, if you will, the moment when Princess Zelda plays the Ocarina of Time at the conclusion of that epic tale, sending the hero of time backward through the streams of temporal flow to reclaim the childhood that had been stolen from him by destiny's demands. In that instant of profound magical intervention, something unprecedented occurs in the carefully ordered flow of time itself. Not just the hero is moved from one moment to another, but the very fabric of reality splits like silk torn by divine hands. We witness this phenomenon with our own eyes as Link awakens in the child timeline, his body restored to youth but his memories intact, and there before him sits the Master Sword, gleaming with that familiar blue-white radiance that speaks of powers beyond mortal comprehension. Yet here lies the first thread of a mystery that grows more complex the deeper we follow its implications into the labyrinthine nature of time and divine will. The blade that Link carried on his back as Zelda's magic transported him through the temporal barriers was not simply left behind in the adult timeline it traveled with him, becoming part of a new continuity, while simultaneously leaving the adult timeline bereft of its most sacred protector. This is no mere oversight in the cosmic order, but evidence of something far more fundamental about the nature of divine artifacts and their relationship to the flow of time itself. The Master Sword, crafted by the goddess Hylia herself in ages before memory, exists as more than mere metal and magical energy. It is a concept made manifest, the physical embodiment of divine will to combat darkness, and as such, it operates according to laws that transcend normal understanding of cause and effect. Just as the goddess herself can exist across multiple planes of reality simultaneously, so too might her greatest creation exist in ways that defy simple, linear progression through time. Evidence of this profound truth becomes apparent when we examine the hero of Twilight's journey through the ruins of the Temple of Time, in that sacred grove where ancient magic still flows like water through hidden channels. When Link travels to the past within that crumbling sanctuary and places the Master Sword in its pedestal, he creates a temporal paradox that should not be possible if there were only one blade existing across all of time. In the past that the hero of Twilight visits, the sword should already be present in its stone resting place, waiting for the hero of time to claim it in the events that preceded this very moment. Yet the pedestal stands empty, suggesting that the Master Sword exists as a singular entity that can only occupy one point in the vast tapestry of time at any given moment. When Link carries it in the present, it cannot simultaneously rest in the past, even though linear causality would seem to demand such an impossibility. This leads us to a revelation that shakes the very foundations of what we understand about divine weapons and temporal mechanics. The Master Sword that appears in the Wind Waker, that legendary blade discovered in the sacred chamber beneath the flooded ruins of Hyrule Castle, bears differences so subtle yet significant that they suggest an entirely different origin than the sword we knew from ages past. The physical appearance of this blade speaks to hands other than those of the goddess herself. Where the original Master Sword bore the elegant simplicity of divine craftsmanship, this new incarnation displays decorative elements that suggest mortal artistry symbols etched into its surface that bear no resemblance to the flowing scripts of the ancient Sheikah or the geometric patterns that mark truly ancient Hylian artifacts. The chamber where this sword rests tells its own story of mortal intervention in divine affairs. Surrounded by images of the sages from Ocarina of Time, this underwater sanctuary was clearly constructed by human hands as a deliberate echo of divine architecture, complete with ceremonial elements that honor the memory of those who had fallen in the great battle against darkness. This is not a goddess's workshop, but a memorial created by survivors who understood that their salvation lay in recreating what had been lost. Most telling of all is the sword's unique requirement for empowerment, the prayers of two living sages to restore its power to repel evil. The original Master Sword drew its strength directly from the goddess herself, requiring no mortal intervention to maintain its sacred purpose. This new blade, however, operates on entirely different principles, drawing power from human devotion and sacrifice rather than divine blessing, suggesting a fundamental difference in its essential nature. The words of Ganondorf himself provide the final piece of evidence in this puzzle of duplicate divinity. When he encounters Link wielding this underwater blade, his reaction carries the weight of knowledge earned through centuries of conflict with the original weapon. He speaks not with the respect he once showed for the goddess's creation, but with contempt for what he recognizes as mortal artifice, attempting to replicate divine perfection. His reference to the pathetic fools who made this blade cannot be interpreted as referring to the goddess Hylia and her divine craftsmen. Even in his darkest moments, Ganondorf has never shown such disrespect for the divine powers that shaped the Triforce he so desperately covets. These are the words of one who recognizes the difference between authentic divine creation and skilled but ultimately mortal imitation. The sages who remained in the adult timeline after the Hero of Time's departure faced an impossible situation. Their world had been saved from immediate destruction. But the instrument of that salvation, the Master Sword itself, had vanished along with its wielder, leaving them defenseless against the inevitable return of ancient evil. Ganondorf's parting words had promised his return, and the sages understood with crystal clarity that their temporary victory would become permanent defeat unless they could provide future heroes with weapons capable of facing darkness. Working with the finest craftsmen and scholars remaining in Hyrule, drawing upon fragments of ancient knowledge preserved in sacred texts and the memories of those who had witnessed the original blade in action, the sages embarked upon the most ambitious project in their people's history. They would create a new Master Sword, one that operated on principles they could understand and maintain, powered by their own spiritual energy rather than distant divine blessing. The result was a masterwork of mortal craftsmanship, inspired by divine example, a blade that could channel the sages' combined power into a weapon capable of sealing darkness, even if it could never truly replicate the effortless perfection of its divine predecessor. This new Master Sword served its purpose admirably, containing Ganondorf's power within the flooded ruins of Hyrule until a new hero could arise to wield it against the returning darkness. Yet the very success of this mortal creation raises profound questions about the nature of divine artifacts and their relationship to the worlds they protect. If human hands guided by divine inspiration can create weapons capable of matching the power of goddess-forged blades, what does this say about the true source of the Master Sword's strength? Perhaps the power was never truly in the metal and magic, but in the purpose it served, and the courage of those who wielded it in the cause of light. The implications of multiple master swords existing across different timelines extend far beyond mere academic curiosity about divine smithcraft. They suggest a universe where the goddess's influence operates through principles of inspiration and guidance rather than direct intervention, where mortal devotion and skill can recreate divine miracles through understanding of sacred purpose rather than mere replication of physical form. This understanding transforms our perception of heroism itself. If the Master Sword's true power lies not in its divine origin, but in the courage and righteousness of those who wield it, then every person who stands against darkness with whatever weapon they can find carries within themselves the potential to become a sacred blade in the goddess's service. The legend of the Master Sword becomes not the story of a single, irreplaceable artifact, but of an ideal that can manifest wherever and whenever the forces of light require a champion, whether forged by divine hands in the dawn of time, or crafted by mortal sages in humanity's darkest hour. Each blade serves the same eternal purpose: to be the physical manifestation of hope in the face of despair, courage in the face of terror, and light in the face of absolute darkness. As we drift deeper into contemplation of these mysteries, we begin to understand that the question of whether multiple Master Swords exist across the timeline may be less important than what their existence represents. They are symbols of the unbreakable connection between divine will and mortal action, proof that the goddess's greatest gift to her children was not any single weapon or tool, but the capacity to rise above their limitations when the cause demands it. In this understanding, we find not confusion but comfort. The Master Sword, whether singular or manifold, remains eternal not as a piece of metal that can be lost or broken, but as an idea that lives in every heart brave enough to stand against the darkness, whether that heart beats in the chest of a legendary hero or an ordinary person who simply refuses to surrender to despair. Act 3. The weight of regret. In the gentle twilight hours that follow great victories, when the cheers of celebration have faded into memory, and the heroes have departed for whatever rest their weary souls can find, there often remains a single figure who cannot join in the revelry that surrounds him. Such was the fate of Mido, that fiery-haired Kokiri whose name has echoed through the centuries in ways that few who knew him as a child could ever have imagined. The story of Mido begins, as so many tales of transformation do, with the bitter seeds of jealousy and wounded pride planted in a young heart that had not yet learned the difference between being important and being worthy. In the peaceful days before darkness fell across Hyrule like a shroud woven from nightmares, Mido served as the self-appointed leader of the Kokiri children, a position he wore like armor against his own insecurities, about his place in a world where eternal childhood sometimes felt more like a curse than a blessing. When the great Deku Tree called for Link personally, requesting an audience with the boy who had always seemed different from the other forest children, Mido's reaction revealed the depths of envy that had been growing in his heart like poison ivy around a healthy tree. Here was Link, who had no fairy companion to mark him as truly Kokiri, being summoned by their beloved guardian, while Mido, who had worked so hard to establish himself as their leader, was ignored as if he were no more significant than any other child playing in the forest shadows. The physical confrontation that followed, where Mido literally blocked Link's path to the Deku Tree with his body and demanded that the would-be hero prove himself by acquiring a sword and shield, was more than mere game mechanics designed to teach players about equipment. It was the manifestation of a deeper wound in Mido's soul, a desperate attempt to assert his importance in a moment when he felt most overlooked and undervalued. Behind his demands for proof of readiness lay a more painful truth that Mido himself might not have been able to articulate at the time. He was not simply testing Link's preparedness for adventure, but challenging the fundamental unfairness of a world where recognition and divine attention seemed to fall upon those who had done nothing special to earn them. Why should Link, the outsider without a fairy, be chosen over Mido, who had dedicated his childhood to caring for the other Kokiri children? The tragedy deepened when Link's meeting with the great Deku Tree resulted in the ancient guardian's death, an outcome that Mido immediately and vocally blamed on the boy he had reluctantly allowed to pass. In his grief and confusion, Mido spread word throughout the forest that Link had somehow caused their protector's demise, turning the other Kokiri children against the hero just when Link most needed their support and understanding. This act of blame casting reveals something profound about the nature of guilt and how it can drive even good people to commit acts of cruelty that they would never consider under normal circumstances. Mido was not evil, nor was he acting from pure malice, but his pain at losing the Deku Tree combined with his existing resentment toward Link created a perfect storm of misdirected anger that would have consequences lasting far beyond the immediate moment. When monsters began to overrun the once peaceful Kokiri forest in the aftermath of their guardian's death, the blame that Mido had placed on Link became even more entrenched in the minds of the forest children. The correlation between Link's arrival, the Deku Tree's death, and the subsequent invasion of evil creatures seemed to validate Mido's accusations, creating a narrative that cast their former friend as the architect of their misfortune rather than the hero who had tried to save them. 7 long years passed in the adult timeline, years during which the shadow of Ganondorf's reign fell across Hyrule like a plague that poisoned everything it touched. The Kokiri children, trapped in their corrupted forest home, had to learn to survive in a world where innocence was no longer protection and where the games of childhood had been replaced by the grim business of staying alive in a realm overrun by monsters. Throughout this dark period, Mido maintained his position as leader of the surviving Kokiri, but it was a leadership born of necessity rather than joy. The responsibilities that had once seemed like privileges now felt like chains, binding him to a community that looked to him for guidance he was not sure he was qualified to give. Yet he persevered, protecting what remained of their forest home and keeping alive whatever hope he could manage in the face of seemingly endless darkness. When Link returned to the Kokiri forest as an adult, Mido did not recognize the legendary hero in the tall, strong figure who approached him wearing clothes that reminded him painfully of their shared childhood. The boy who had left the forest as a child had returned as a man, transformed by trials and responsibilities that had aged his spirit even more than his body. Yet something in his bearing or his movements struck a chord of familiarity that Mido could not quite place. The moment when Mido heard Saria's song played upon the ocarina, that haunting melody that his lost friend had shared only with those closest to her heart, became a revelation that shattered the walls of resentment he had built around his wounded pride. Here was proof that this mysterious adult was indeed someone Saria had cared about deeply, someone who had earned her trust and affection in ways that Mido himself had never managed, despite years of devotion. The conversation that followed, where Link explained that Saria would not be returning because she had become a sage, forced Mido to confront not only the reality of their friend's sacrifice, but also the terrible possibility that his own actions had contributed to the pain she must have felt when leaving the forest forever. In that moment of understanding, the barriers between past and present, between pride and truth, came crashing down like walls built on foundations of sand. Mido's final words to the adult Link carry within them all the weight of 7 years of regret and the desperate hope for forgiveness that had been growing in his heart throughout the dark times. His admission that he had been mean to Link, his plea that Link be told of Saria's waiting and hoping for his return, and most profoundly, his apology delivered to someone he believed to be a complete stranger, reveal the depth of transformation that suffering and time had worked upon his character. The beautiful tragedy of this moment lies in the fact that Mido was speaking directly to the person he was apologizing to, yet neither of them fully understood the significance of what was happening. Link, with his memories intact but his appearance transformed, was receiving the apology he had never expected to hear, while Mido was unburdening his heart to someone he thought could carry his message to the boy he had wronged so many years before. But perhaps the most telling moment in Mido's story comes not during this conversation but afterward, during the great celebration that marked Ganondorf's defeat and the restoration of peace to Hyrule. While representatives from every race and region gathered at Lon Lon Ranch to dance and sing in joy at their liberation from 7 years of darkness, while even the Kokiri children joined in the festivities with laughter that seemed to make up for all the joy they had been denied during the long nightmare, Mido sat apart from the celebration, alone with his thoughts and his grief. The visual symbolism of this scene speaks to something deeper than mere sadness at Saria's permanent departure, though that loss was certainly part of his melancholy. Mido's isolation during the victory celebration represents the unique burden carried by those who must live with the knowledge of their own failures at moments when others can celebrate without reservation. Every other person at that gathering could look back on the recent struggles with the satisfaction of knowing they had done their best to oppose the forces of darkness, even if their individual contributions had been small. The Kokiri children could remember their resistance to the monsters that invaded their forest. The Gorons could take pride in their endurance, despite the corruption of their sacred mountain. The Zora could celebrate their survival and their princess's heroic sacrifice. But Mido carried with him the knowledge that when his world's greatest hero had needed support and understanding, he had instead offered obstacle and accusation. When Link had most required the backing of his childhood community, Mido had turned that community against him. The celebration of Link's victory became, for Mido, a reminder of his own failure to recognize heroism when it stood before him asking for help. Yet this moment of solitary reflection also marks the beginning of something far more significant than mere regret. The transformation visible in Mido's behavior throughout his interactions with the adult. Link, his willingness to step aside when presented with evidence of worthiness, his concern for Saria's feelings, his unprompted apology for past wrongs suggests a fundamental change in his character that would have profound implications for his future actions. The appearance of Mido's name among the honored towns in the adventure of Link centuries later in the Fallen timeline provides tantalizing evidence that this personal transformation was only the beginning of a much larger story of redemption and heroism. The towns of that distant era were named after the sages who had become legendary for their sacrifices in the great battles against darkness, suggesting that Mido himself must have achieved something comparable to earn such lasting honor. The most likely explanation for this posthumous recognition lies in the events that would have followed the Hero of Time's defeat in the Fallen timeline. Without Link to stand against Ganondorf's ultimate victory, the responsibility for resistance would have fallen upon the survivors, the sages, the royal family, and any others brave enough to take up arms against the forces of darkness that poured forth from the corrupted sacred realm. In such circumstances, Mido's intimate knowledge of forest warfare, his experience leading the Kokiri through years of monster-infested wilderness, and most importantly, his burning desire to make amends for past failures, would have made him a natural leader in the resistance efforts that became known as the Imprisoning War. The boy who had once blocked a hero's path might well have become the man who opened the way for others to follow in heroism's footsteps. The poetic justice of such a transformation speaks to deeper truths about the nature of redemption and the possibility for growth even in the darkest of circumstances. Mido's journey from jealous child to potential war hero represents the kind of character development that can only occur when someone is forced to confront their own limitations and choose between perpetual bitterness and the difficult work of becoming worthy of the respect they had always craved. If indeed Mido did lead the Kokiri out of their forest home to join the greater struggle against Ganon's forces, his decision would have carried profound significance beyond its immediate military value. The Kokiri's departure from their forest sanctuary would have represented the end of their eternal childhood and their transformation into mortal beings capable of aging, growing, and ultimately dying for causes greater than themselves. This sacrifice, trading immortal safety for mortal purpose, would have been the ultimate expression of the wisdom Mido had gained through years of regret and reflection. No longer the boy who demanded recognition without earning it, he would have become the leader who understood that true heroism requires the willingness to give up everything for the sake of others, even when those others might never know the price that was paid on their behalf. The Kokiri, who followed Mido into this final battle, would have done so knowing that they were abandoning not just their homes but their very nature as eternal children, choosing to become adults in the fullest sense of the word beings, capable of both great achievement and ultimate sacrifice. Under Mido's leadership, they would have learned that growing up is not merely a matter of physical change, but of accepting responsibility for something larger than oneself. In the end, whether Mido's name appears among the honored towns because of military leadership, civilian heroism, or simply the power of his example in overcoming personal failings, his story represents one of the most profound character arcs in all of Hyrule's long history. From a jealous child who blocked the path of destiny to a leader who opened new paths for others to follow, his transformation reminds us that even the most flawed among us carry within ourselves the potential for greatness, if only we have the courage to face our failures and the wisdom to learn from them. As we contemplate Mido's solitary figure at that long-ago celebration, sitting apart from the joy that surrounded him, we might see not just sadness, but the quiet dignity of someone who has looked honestly at his own heart and found it wanting, and who had resolved to spend whatever time remained to him, ensuring that when judgment came, whether from gods or from his own conscience, he would be found worthy of the forgiveness he sought. Act 4. The severing of power. In the deepest chambers of understanding where the nature of power reveals its most profound secrets, there exists a moment, so brief, yet so decisive, that it reshapes the destiny of kingdoms with nothing more than the subtle movement of a neck turned too far to one side. The death of Ganondorf at the conclusion of Twilight Princess represents far more than the simple victory of good over evil. It is a meditation on the nature of borrowed strength, the fragility of false godhood, and the ultimate powerlessness of those who mistake dominion for divinity. To understand the true significance of Xant's final gesture, that seemingly simple crack of vertebrae that severed not just bone but the very lifeline of the Demon King himself, we must first journey backward through the labyrinthine paths of cause and effect that led to this moment of ultimate betrayal. The story begins not with death, but with a promise, not with weakness, but with the intoxicating illusion of strength beyond mortal comprehension. When Ganondorf first materialized before the usurper king of the Twilight Realm like a divine apparition wreathed in power and malice, Xant saw in him everything he had always believed he deserved, but had been denied by the natural order of succession. Here was a being who understood ambition, who recognized the injustice of merit, overlooked in favor of bloodline, who offered not just sympathy, but the means to claim what rightfully belonged to the worthy rather than the merely well-born. The pact that formed between these two figures, one a fallen Gerudo king transformed by centuries of hatred into something barely recognizable as once having been mortal, the other a brilliant scholar whose talents had been dismissed by those too comfortable in their inherited positions to recognize genius, when it stood before them, was built upon foundations that seemed solid as bedrock, but proved to be as fragile as morning frost, touched by the first rays of sunlight. Ganondorf's offer to share his power with Zant was not born from generosity or recognition of kinship between kindred spirits, though Zant may have interpreted it as such in his desperate hunger for validation. Rather, it was a calculated investment by a being who had learned through painful experience that direct conquest often fails where subtle manipulation succeeds, that sometimes the most effective path to dominion runs through the ambitions of others who can be guided to serve purposes they believe to be their own. The power that flowed from Ganondorf into Zant was not simply magical energy transferred from one vessel to another, like water poured from pitcher to cup. It was a fragment of the Triforce of Power itself, that divine artifact that had chosen Ganondorf as its bearer in ages past and had sustained him through death and imprisonment, through transformations that would have destroyed any lesser being, through the endless cycles of defeat and resurrection that marked his eternal struggle against the forces of light. This sharing of divine essence created between Ganondorf and Zant a connection deeper than master and servant, more intimate than king and subject, more binding than any contract sworn upon sacred relics or witnessed by the gods themselves. They became two aspects of a single malevolent will, two faces of the same corruption, two expressions of identical hunger for domination, dressed in different cultural garments, but driven by fundamentally similar desires. Yet even as Zant reveled in his newfound abilities, the power to transform Princess Midna into an imp, to shatter the mirror of twilight, to survive in the realm of light despite his twilight heritage, to command armies of shadow beasts and bend the very fabric of reality to his whims, the relationship between the two Dark Lords remained fundamentally unequal. Zant was the recipient of power, not its source, the vessel rather than the wellspring, the instrument rather than the hand that wielded it. This inequality became painfully apparent as Zant's campaign to merge the realms of light and twilight progressed from initial triumph to gradual frustration to ultimate defeat. Each setback in his grand design revealed more clearly that his borrowed strength had limitations that his own native abilities did not, that the power he wielded so confidently was subject to conditions and restrictions he had not anticipated when first accepting Ganondorf's dark gift. The transformation of Princess Midna, which should have rendered the rightful ruler of the Twilight Realm permanently harmless, instead created an adversary whose determination was strengthened rather than broken by her reduction to imp form. The shattering of the mirror of twilight, which should have forever severed the connection between realms and made Zant's conquest irreversible, instead drove his enemies to seek alternative paths to their goal, with a resourcefulness that surprised him. Most troubling of all was the emergence of a new hero, another link to stand against the darkness as so many had stood before him throughout the turning of ages. This development struck at the heart of everything Ganondorf had promised about the inevitability of their victory, the certainty that this time would be different from all the previous failed attempts to claim dominion over Hyrule and her people. As defeat followed, defeat and the hero of Twilight carved a path of liberation through Zant's carefully constructed empire of shadows, the usurper king began to exhibit signs of the psychological strain that comes from discovering that borrowed power is not truly owned power, that strength granted by another can be influenced by factors beyond the recipient's control or understanding. The final confrontation between Zant and Link played out in the bizarre chambers of the Palace of Twilight, where reality itself seemed subject to the whims of a mind unraveling under the pressure of repeated failure, revealed the full extent of the transformation that had taken place in Xant's psyche. The dignified scholar who had once petitioned reasonably for recognition of his talents had been replaced by something manic and desperate, a creature whose power had outgrown his wisdom and whose ambition had consumed his sanity. Yet even in defeat, even as Link's blade found its mark and Xant's body fell lifeless in the heart of his own palace, the connection between the usurper king and his dark patron endured. Death, it seemed, could not sever the bond forged by shared essence of the Triforce of power, and Xant's consciousness persisted in whatever realm awaits those who have been touched by divine artifacts, watching and waiting as events continued to unfold in the world of the living. From this ethereal vantage point, Xant witnessed the final battle between Link and Ganondorf, saw his former patron struggle against the same hero who had brought about his own downfall, observed the familiar pattern of initial confidence, giving way to frustrated rage as another chosen champion of light proved equal to the challenge of facing concentrated darkness. But more than merely witnessing, Xant began to understand during those climactic moments truths about his relationship with Ganondorf that had been hidden from him during their time as allies. He saw with the clarity that comes only in death that he had never been a partner in Ganondorf's grand design, but merely another tool to be used and discarded, no different from the countless minions and monsters that the Demon King had employed throughout his long career of conquest and failure. The promise of shared dominion over a conquered Hyrule, the vision of two Dark Lords ruling side by side over a realm transformed according to their mutual will, revealed itself to be nothing more than comfortable lies, told to secure Xant's cooperation in a plan that had never included his long-term survival or happiness. Ganondorf had intended from the beginning to reclaim whatever power he had shared once it had served its purpose, leaving Xant with nothing but the memory of brief glory and the bitter knowledge of having been deceived. This revelation transformed whatever loyalty Xant might have retained toward his former patron into something far more dangerous to a being whose continued existence depended upon maintaining access to the fragmented power of the tainted Triforce. Where once there had been devotion born of gratitude, now there was resentment born of betrayal. Where once there had been eagerness to serve, now there was determination to deny. The moment when Ganondorf's hand began to glow with the familiar light of the Triforce of power, that desperate call upon divine strength that had saved him from death so many times before, became the moment when Xant finally had the opportunity to demonstrate what he had learned about the true nature of their relationship. The request for power that should have been automatically granted, the plea for strength that had never before been refused, encountered for the first time not acceptance, but deliberate rejection. The gesture itself, that simple rotation of the neck that produced an audible crack of breaking bone, served as both symbol and mechanism of denial. In life, Xant had been forced to bow before Ganondorf's superior will, to acknowledge the hierarchy that placed him forever in a subordinate position despite his intelligence and abilities. In death, he claimed the right to refuse submission, to turn away from his former master with a finality that physical existence had never permitted. But the true power of this gesture lay not in its symbolic significance, but in its practical effect upon the metaphysical connection that bound Ganondorf's fate to the fragment of Triforce power that resided with Xant's spirit. By refusing to allow that power to return to its original bearer, by maintaining his grip upon the divine essence even beyond the grave, Xant effectively severed Ganondorf's access to the strength that had sustained him through countless resurrections and transformations. The Demon King's death, which followed immediately upon Xant's refusal, represents more than the triumph of heroic swordplay over evil sorcery. It demonstrates the fundamental vulnerability of all power structures built upon the cooperation of subordinates who retain the capacity for independent choice. Ganondorf had made himself dependent upon Xant's continued willingness to serve, and when that willingness transformed into active opposition, the entire edifice of borrowed strength collapsed like a tower built on sand. In the profound silence that followed Ganondorf's final breath, as his body remained upright with the Master Sword piercing his heart like a monument to the eventual victory of justice over oppression, we might imagine Xant's spirit finally finding the peace that had eluded him throughout his life of frustrated ambition and his death of desperate struggle. The power he had sought so desperately was his at last, not through dominion over others, but through mastery over his own choices, including the choice to deny power to one who had abused the trust implicit in all relationships between leader and follower. The lesson embedded in this moment of ultimate reversal speaks to truths that extend far beyond the magical realm of Hyrule into the fundamental nature of authority and rebellion in all times and places. Those who would rule through fear and manipulation, who build their strength upon the subjugation of others, create within their very success the seeds of their eventual destruction. For every subordinate carries within themselves the power to choose loyalty or betrayal, cooperation or resistance, service or sabotage. Xant's final act reminds us that no amount of borrowed power can substitute for the genuine respect and loyalty that must be earned rather than commanded, inspired rather than demanded. Ganondorf's failure was not ultimately one of strategy or strength, but of understanding the human heart and its capacity for both devotion and revenge, its ability to transform from the source of power into the instrument of downfall. As we contemplate this moment when the crack of a neck became the sound of empires falling and the whisper of spiritual rebellion became the roar of cosmic justice, we understand that power, no matter how vast or seemingly secure, remains always subject to the choices of those who grant it legitimacy through their participation in its exercise. The mightiest tyrant is only as strong as the willingness of others to acknowledge their authority, and when that acknowledgement is withdrawn, even divine artifacts cannot preserve what mortal cooperation has chosen to destroy. Act 5. The Abandoned Thread. In the vast tapestry of time, where threads of causality weave together to form the patterns we call history, there exists a peculiar knot that has troubled scholars and sages for generations, a logical impossibility that sits at the very heart of Hyrule's official chronology, like a riddle wrapped in paradox and bound with the silken cords of divine mystery. The fallen timeline, as it has come to be known in the sacred texts and scholarly debates, presents us with a conundrum so profound that it challenges not merely our understanding of temporal mechanics, but our very conception of what constitutes canonical truth in a universe governed by the whims of goddesses and the choices of heroes. To understand the true nature of this temporal anomaly, we must first examine the elegant simplicity of the timeline split that occurs at the conclusion of Ocarina of Time, when Princess Zelda's use of the ocarina creates two distinct branches of reality through the miracle of divine intervention. The adult timeline continues forward from the moment of Ganondorf's defeat, while the child timeline springs into existence when Link is sent backward to reclaim the childhood that destiny had stolen from him. These two paths through time operate according to principles that, while magical in their implementation, follow logical patterns that the mind can grasp and accept. Each timeline represents a legitimate continuation of the events we witnessed during Link's quest, a natural consequence of actions taken and choices made by characters whose motivations we understand. and whose abilities we have seen demonstrated. When Link pulls the Master Sword and awakens 7 years in the future, we accept this progression because it follows inevitably from the established rules of the Temple of Time's sacred magic. When Zelda sends him back to his proper time, we understand this reversal because it represents the logical application of temporal manipulation that her royal bloodline and the Ocarina's power make possible. But the fallen timeline operates according to entirely different principles, ones that seem to violate the fundamental logic that governs narrative causality and temporal consistency. Rather than arising from the natural progression of established events, this third branch of history springs into existence through what can only be described as a conditional statement. If Link falls in battle against Ganondorf, then an entirely separate sequence of events unfolds, leading to outcomes that bear no relation to anything we have actually witnessed or experienced during our journey through Hyrule's destiny. The logical flaw in this construction becomes apparent when we consider the implications of treating hypothetical failure as equivalent to actual success in terms of canonical weight and historical significance. If we accept that Link's potential death at Ganondorf's hands creates a legitimate timeline worthy of inclusion in the official chronology, then we must also accept that every other moment of potential failure throughout his quest, every battle with a monster that could have ended in defeat, every puzzle that could have remained unsolved, every choice that could have led to disaster also creates its own timeline branch. The result would be an infinite multiplication of realities, each one spawned by a different moment of theoretical failure, until the very concept of canonical history dissolves into a chaos of possibilities, where nothing can be said to be truly true, because everything that could have happened in some timeline actually did happen. Such a universe would render meaningless the very idea of heroic achievement, since every triumph would be balanced by an equal number of failures, every victory made hollow by the knowledge that defeat was equally real in some other branch of possibility. Yet, despite these logical impossibilities, the fallen timeline clearly exists as part of Hyrule's accepted history, home to games and events that have been experienced by countless adventurers and documented in sacred texts whose authenticity cannot be questioned. The contradiction between its impossible nature and its undeniable existence points to a deeper truth that has been hidden beneath layers of assumption about the nature of time and causality in a universe touched by divine power. The solution to this paradox lies not in accepting the impossible conditional statement that failure creates reality, but in recognizing that what we call the fallen timeline is actually something far more elegant and inevitable. The original timeline that was abandoned when Link's journey through time created the familiar split between adult-child continuities. This abandoned thread of reality, left behind like a discarded rough draft when Zelda's magic rewrote the story of destiny itself, continued to exist and unfold according to its own natural progression, creating the conditions that scholars have mistakenly attributed to hypothetical heroic failure. To understand how this abandonment occurred, we must trace the subtle mechanics of Link's temporal journey with the precision of master craftsmen, examining the gears and springs of an ancient clock. When Link first drew the Master Sword from its pedestal and was transported 7 years into the future, he was not simply moving forward along a single timeline, but stepping sideways into a parallel track of reality where those 7 years had already elapsed and events had unfolded without his presence or intervention. This future timeline, where Ganondorf had consolidated his power and transformed Hyrule into a realm of shadow and suffering, became the stage upon which Link's adult adventures played out. Yet his original timeline, the thread of reality from which he had been plucked by the sword's magic, did not simply cease to exist when he departed from it. Time, like a river that continues to flow even when we step out of its current, proceeded according to its own natural rhythms and patterns. In this original timeline, the sequence of events that had been set in motion by Link's initial quest continued to unfold with the inexorable logic of cause and effect. The spiritual stones he had gathered still enabled access to the Temple of Time. The door he had opened still granted passage to the Master Sword's resting place. But crucially, the hero who should have claimed that blade was no longer present to fulfill his destined role, having been transported to a different temporal stream entirely. Without Link to serve as the goddess's chosen champion, without his courage and determination to stand against the forces of darkness, the carefully balanced struggle between light and shadow that should have culminated in heroic victory instead shifted decisively in favor of evil. Ganondorf, faced with no meaningful opposition from a hero who had vanished from the timeline entirely, was free to pursue his ambitions with an efficiency and thoroughness that even he had never dared imagine possible. The Sacred Realm, that holy sanctuary where the Triforce awaited the touch of one pure of heart, fell to Ganondorf's corruption, not through the dramatic conquest described in tales of his hypothetical victory over Link, but through the simple absence of anyone capable of preventing his methodical advance toward ultimate power. The transformation of the Sacred Realm into the Dark World proceeded according to the established patterns of malice, spreading unchecked through divine spaces, creating the parallel realm of shadow that would plague Hyrule for generations to come. This understanding transforms our perception of the fallen timeline from an impossible anomaly into an inevitable consequence of the temporal mechanics that govern divine intervention in mortal affairs. Rather than representing Link's failure, it represents the natural progression of events in a world where Link had never been present to succeed or fail, where his absence created a vacuum that darkness rushed to fill with the eagerness of water flowing into a dry riverbed. The profound irony of this situation reveals itself when we consider that Zelda's act of mercy in sending Link back to reclaim his childhood, an intervention born from love and concern for the boy who had sacrificed so much for the sake of her kingdom, inadvertently created the very timeline of disaster that her earlier actions had been designed to prevent. By removing Link from the adult timeline and placing him in the child timeline, she ensured that his original thread of reality would continue without him, vulnerable to all the dangers that his presence had been meant to forestall. This temporal orphaning explains many of the unique characteristics that distinguish the fallen timeline from its more familiar siblings. The specific nature of Ganondorf's victory, the particular way in which the forces of light eventually rallied to contain his power, the precise sequence of events that led to the imprisoning war. All of these elements reflect not the consequences of Link's defeat, but the natural evolution of a world where Link had never been present to shape the course of history through his choices and actions. The sages who eventually succeeded in sealing Ganondorf within the Dark World were operating without the benefit of Link's guidance, without the inspiration of his example, without the hope that his presence would have provided to rally their courage in the darkest hours of their struggle. Their victory, when it finally came, was achieved through entirely different means than those employed in the timelines where Link's heroism served as a catalyst for triumph. The kingdoms that rose and fell in the ages following the imprisoning war developed according to patterns that had never been touched by Link's influence, creating cultures and traditions that bore no trace of the changes his heroism would have wrought in the social and political fabric of Hyrule. The very geography of the land evolved differently, shaped by conflicts and catastrophes that his presence might have prevented or redirected toward less destructive outcomes. Yet, perhaps the most poignant aspect of this abandoned timeline is its fundamental loneliness. The cosmic solitude of a reality that had been prepared for heroism but forced to make do without heroes, that had been designed for the partnership between mortal courage and divine blessing, but instead had to rely solely on mortal determination and sacrifice to achieve what should have been accomplished through the elegant cooperation of earthly and heavenly powers. The people of this timeline, lacking the hope and inspiration that Link's example would have provided, were forced to develop different virtues and different strengths to survive the trials that fate placed before them. Their heroism, when it emerged, took forms that were perhaps more collective and less individual, more gradual and less dramatic, more grounded in human determination and less dependent on divine intervention. This understanding casts the events recorded in the fallen timeline in a new light, transforming them from tales of failure and catastrophe into stories of resilience and adaptation in the face of abandonment by destiny itself. The heroes who eventually emerged to challenge the forces of darkness did so without the benefit of legendary weapons or divine guidance, relying instead on their own ingenuity and determination to create the tools and strategies they needed for victory. The magic systems that developed in this timeline, the political structures that evolved to govern its kingdoms, the very relationship between mortals and gods that characterized its spiritual landscape, all reflect the adaptations that became necessary when a world designed for one type of heroic narrative was forced to create an entirely different kind of story from the raw materials of human courage and divine indifference. In contemplating the true nature of the fallen timeline as an abandoned thread of reality rather than a failed branch of possibility, we gain insight not only into the mechanics of temporal manipulation, but into the deeper questions of destiny and free will that underlie all heroic narratives. The existence of this orphan timeline reminds us that even the most carefully laid plans of gods and goddesses remain subject to the unintended consequences of well-meaning intervention, that every act of temporal manipulation carries within it the potential for creating new forms of suffering even as it seeks to alleviate existing pain. Yet, it also speaks to the remarkable resilience of life and hope in the face of cosmic abandonment, the ability of mortals to create meaning and achieve victory even when the universe seems to have forgotten their existence. The abandoned timeline stands as testimony to the truth that heroism need not always wear the shining armor of divine favor, that courage can flourish even in soil that has never been blessed by the presence of chosen champions. As we drift toward the peaceful shores of sleep, we might find comfort in this understanding that even in timelines where heroes never arrive, where destinies go unfulfilled and prophecies remain unspoken, the fundamental capacity for goodness and courage that defines the mortal heart continues to assert itself against the forces of darkness, finding ways to create light, even in realities that seem permanently shrouded in shadow. Act 6. The hero's final battle. In the twilight realm between legend and history, where the deeds of heroes fade into whispered memories and the price of glory is measured not in gold but in years that can never be reclaimed, there stands a mystery wrapped in chainmail and sorrow, the spectre of one whose name once rang through the halls of Hyrule Castle, like a bell calling the faithful to prayer, yet whose final moments remain shrouded in shadows deeper than any dungeon he ever explored in life. The hero Shade, that skeletal warrior who appears to the hero of Twilight like a fever dream born from ancient battlefields and unfinished oaths, carries within his very appearance the scattered clues to a story that no chronicler ever recorded, no bard ever sang, no monument ever commemorated. His is the tale of how legends end, not with triumphant fanfares, but with the quiet closing of eyes that have seen too much. The final breath drawn in places where no one will ever think to look for heroes' graves. The armor that encases his ethereal form speaks of a life that continued long beyond the childhood adventures that made him famous. Years spent not in the comfortable retirement that grateful kingdoms usually provide their saviors, but in the harder service that comes when peace proves more fragile than anyone dared hope. This is not the simple green tunic of a forest boy or the practical leathers of a traveling adventurer, but the full war harness of a professional soldier chainmail that has been tested by real combat, plates that have turned aside genuine death strokes, a helmet adorned with ceremonial flourishes that speak of rank earned through blood and sacrifice. Every piece of this ghostly equipment tells its own story of battles fought in causes whose names have been forgotten by all save the spirits of the dead. The horn that has been cleanly severed from his helmet suggests enemies who fought with precision rather than mere savagery, foes who understood the science of warfare well enough to target the weak points in even the finest armor. The eye that stares sightless from the depths of his skull speaks of wounds that pierce through the gaps that even master armorers cannot completely seal, injuries that no amount of skill or courage could have prevented once the conditions for their infliction had been met. But perhaps most telling of all is the vegetation that clings to his spectral form, like a shroud woven from the memory of seasons. The leaves and vines that speak not of peaceful burial in consecrated ground, but of a body that fell where it fought and was claimed by the wilderness long before any searcher might have thought to venture into such remote places. This is the fate of those who die not in the great battles that chroniclers record, but in the smaller, forgotten conflicts that determine the true price of keeping kingdoms safe from the countless threats that never make their way into songs or stories. The hero of time's transformation into this mournful guardian spirit reveals the profound tragedy that can befall even the most successful heroes, the curse of surviving long enough to discover that victory is never permanent, that peace is always temporary, that the sword can never truly be sheathed because somewhere in the darkness, new threats are always taking shape from the endless human capacity for cruelty and corruption. In the years following his triumph over Ganondorf, as the child timeline unfolded according to its own harsh logic of cause and consequence, Link would have found himself in the peculiar position of being the only person in Hyrule who truly understood the magnitude of the dangers that the kingdom had avoided through his intervention. The knowledge he carried of alternate possibilities of what Ganondorf could become, given time and opportunity, of how quickly peace could transform into nightmare, of how easily the machinery of civilization could be corrupted and turned against itself, would have been both blessing and curse, wisdom and burden. This understanding would have driven him to remain vigilant long after others had grown comfortable with the apparent permanence of their restored tranquility. While merchants reopened trade routes and farmers planted crops in fields no longer shadowed by the threat of monsters, while children played games that gradually forgot the reality of recent terrors, the hero of time would have continued to patrol the borderlands and investigate the rumors that others dismissed as the phantoms of an overactive imagination still haunted by memories of darker times. The skills that had made him legendary as a child, the ability to move unseen through hostile territory, to read the signs that warned of approaching danger, to face impossible odds with the calm certainty that courage could triumph over any obstacle, would have served him well in this new role as Hyrule's unofficial guardian against the threats that official guardians were not equipped to recognize or confront. Yet this solitary vigil would have exacted a price that no external enemy could ever have demanded. The very qualities that made him an effective protector, the hypervigilance that allowed him to detect danger before it could fully manifest, the emotional distance necessary to make life or death decisions without hesitation, the willingness to face mortal peril as a routine part of existence, would have gradually isolated him from the peaceful society he fought so hard to preserve. The people he encountered during his wanderings would have seen not the beloved hero of their grandparents' stories, but a grim figure whose very presence reminded them of possibilities they preferred not to contemplate, whose battle-scarred appearance and haunted eyes spoke of realities that had no place in a world that had chosen to believe in the permanence of its own safety. This isolation would have been compounded by the unique burden of his memories, recollections of events that had never happened in this timeline, knowledge of people who had lived and died in realities that no longer existed, grief for losses that he alone remembered because he alone had witnessed the alternatives that his success had prevented. How do you mourn the death of friends who are still alive in this timeline but who sacrificed themselves in another? How do you explain the weight of preventing tragedies that no one else will ever know were even possible? The evidence suggests that Link's final battle took place in some remote corner of the kingdom, far from the populated areas where help might have arrived in time to tip the balance in his favor. The leaves and forest growth that cling to his spectral form indicate a death among trees and undergrowth, in one of those wild places where civilization's influence grows thin and older. More primal forces still hold sway over the natural order. Perhaps he was investigating reports of strange creatures seen moving through the deep woods, following trails that led ever deeper into regions where maps became unreliable and compass needles began to spin without finding true north. Perhaps he was tracking some remnant of Ganondorf's influence that had survived the destruction of its creator, some fragment of malice that had learned to hide in places where light never penetrated and human footsteps rarely disturbed the ancient silence. The nature of his injuries, the destroyed section of armor across his abdomen, the missing eye that speaks of a penetrating wound to the skull, suggests an enemy that fought with intelligence rather than mere animal ferocity. This was not the random violence of a beast defending its territory, but the calculated assault of something that understood anatomy well enough to target the vulnerable points that experience had taught it to recognize in armored opponents. One possibility that haunts the imagination is that his final enemy was none other than Dark Link himself, that shadow-born doppelganger who had challenged him in the Water Temple so many years before, and whose defeat had never been confirmed with the finality that marks the destruction of truly dangerous foes. If this creature of living darkness had somehow survived their encounter, if it had spent the intervening years growing stronger while nursing its hatred for the hero who had bested it, then their final confrontation would have been a battle between perfect equals one representing the light of heroic determination, the other the shadow of that same determination turned inward and corrupted by its own reflection. Such a battle would explain the evidence we see in the hero's shade wounds that could only have been inflicted by someone who knew exactly how Link fought, who could anticipate his tactics and counter his techniques with the precision that comes from sharing not just his abilities but his memories of how those abilities had been used in countless previous encounters. Dark Link would have been the one enemy who could never be surprised by Link's skill, because it possessed that same skill turned toward malevolent purpose. The tragic poetry of such an ending, the hero finally defeated not by external evil, but by his own shadow given autonomous existence, would represent the ultimate expression of the loneliness that had defined his later years. In the end, he would have faced an opponent who understood him perfectly because it was him, stripped of compassion and nobility, but retaining all the deadly competence that had made the original legendary. Yet, regardless of the specific identity of his final opponent, the circumstances of Link's death reveal something profound about the nature of heroism and the price it demands from those who choose to embody its ideals. He died not in the glorious single combat that songs celebrate, but in the grinding reality of a fight that went on too long, against odds that finally proved too great, in service to people who would never know his name or understand what they had lost when his sword finally fell silent. The unfinished business that binds his spirit to the mortal realm, his desperate need to pass on the lessons he had learned through years of solitary struggle, speaks to the deepest fear that haunts all true heroes, that their knowledge and experience will die with them, leaving future generations to face the same dangers without the benefit of hard-won wisdom that could mean the difference between survival and catastrophe. His teachings to the hero of Twilight represent more than mere sword techniques or combat strategies. They are the distillation of a lifetime spent learning how to stand alone against the darkness, how to find courage when hope seems impossible, how to continue fighting even when victory appears beyond reach. These are lessons that cannot be learned from books or lectures, but must be passed directly from one warrior to another through the intimate communion of shared understanding between those who have walked similar paths. The relief that washes over the hero's shade when his instruction is complete, the peace that finally allows him to release his grip on mortal existence and move on to whatever reward awaits the truly heroic dead, suggests that his greatest battle was not against any external enemy, but against the terror that his sacrifices would be forgotten, his wisdom lost, his legacy reduced to nothing more than half-remembered stories told to children who had never known the reality of the dangers he had faced. In teaching the hero of Twilight, he ensured that the knowledge purchased with years of loneliness and pain would continue to serve the cause of light in ages yet to come. The hidden techniques he demonstrated, the combat wisdom he imparted, the spiritual strength he helped cultivate, all of these gifts would flow through the bloodline he had helped to establish, creating an inheritance more valuable than any treasure hoard or royal title. The mystery of the hero of time's death reminds us that legends are built not just from moments of triumph, but from the quiet courage of those who choose to keep fighting long after the crowds have gone home and the victory celebrations have ended. His final battle, fought in solitude against an enemy whose name will never be recorded, represents the truest form of heroism: service without recognition, sacrifice without reward, dedication to duty that endures even beyond the grave. As we contemplate his lonely vigil in those final years, his gradual transformation from celebrated champion to forgotten guardian, we might find in his example not cause for sadness, but inspiration for our own struggles against the smaller darknesses that threaten the peace of our daily lives. For if the hero of time could find meaning in battles that no one would remember, courage in causes that no one would celebrate, and purpose in protection that no one would acknowledge, then perhaps we too can find the strength to persevere in our own anonymous struggles against the forces that would diminish the light in our corner of existence. Act 7. The Lost Children of the Forest. In the deepest chambers of anthropological mystery, where the transformation of peoples becomes legend, and the migration of souls takes physical form across the turning of generations, there lies a story so subtle in its unfolding that it has remained hidden beneath the surface of recorded history, like a river flowing underground, nourishing the roots of possibility while never breaking through into the clear light of accepted fact. This is the tale of how the eternal children of the forest learned mortality, how immortal guardians of sacred groves became simple villagers tending simple fields, and how the loss of divine protection became the foundation for an entirely different kind of strength. The Kokiri, those ageless children who dwelt in harmony with the great Deku tree since time immemorial, represented one of the purest expressions of the goddess Hylia's vision for her created world beings, who existed in perfect balance with the natural order, neither seeking to dominate their environment nor allowing it to overwhelm them. Content to remain forever young in both body and spirit, as they tended the sacred mysteries that kept the forest healthy and whole. Their eternal childhood was not merely a biological curiosity, but a spiritual state that reflected their role as bridges between the mortal realm and the divine forces that shaped the natural world. Like living embodiments of wonder and innocence, they served as guardians, not through strength of arms but through purity of purpose. Their very presence ensuring that the corruption which periodically arose in darker corners of the world could never take root in the heart of their woodland sanctuary. Yet this blessed existence came with restrictions that became apparent only when circumstances forced examination of assumptions that had never before been questioned. The great Deku tree's warning that death would claim any Kokiri who ventured beyond the forest's protective embrace was not merely parental caution, but recognition of a deeper truth about the nature of their immortal existence, that it was sustained, not by any innate quality they possessed, but by their proximity to the divine power that flowed through their ancient guardian. The relationship between the Kokiri and their protector was more intimate than mere geographical proximity might suggest. They were not simply creatures who happened to live near a powerful entity, but extensions of that entity's will and consciousness, given individual form, but remaining connected to their source through bonds that transcended physical distance. Their fairy companions, those luminous spirits that marked them as true children of the forest, served not as pets or friends but as living manifestations of the Deku tree's awareness, allowing the ancient guardian to remain in constant communion with each of his charges, regardless of where their wanderings might lead them within the forest's boundaries. This understanding transforms the warning about death beyond the forest from a simple prohibition into a profound statement about the nature of spiritual ecology and the dependence of eternal beings upon the divine forces that sustain their immortality. To venture beyond the great Deku tree's influence would indeed mean death for the Kokiri, not the immediate physical collapse that might be expected from such warnings, but the gradual transformation from immortal to mortal, the slow awakening from eternal childhood into the complex responsibilities and limited lifespan that defined ordinary human existence. The truth of this revelation became apparent during the victory celebration that followed Ganondorf's defeat in the adult timeline, when the Kokiri children were seen dancing and playing at Lon Lon Ranch, far beyond the boundaries that should have meant their doom if the Deku tree's warnings were to be taken at face value. Their presence at this gathering, alive and joyful despite their distance from their forest home, demonstrated that the death their guardian had warned them about was not the cessation of life, but the end of one form of existence and the beginning of another. Yet this celebration took place in a timeline where the great Deku tree had died and been reborn, where the cycle of death and renewal that governed all natural processes had played out even in the life of one who had seemed exempt from such transitions. The presence of a new Deku tree sprout, nurtured by the forest sage who had once been their friend Saria, provided continuity of protection that allowed the Kokiri to venture beyond their traditional boundaries without immediately losing their essential nature. But in the child timeline, where Link's return to the past had prevented the sequence of events that led to the forest temple's cleansing and the Deku tree sprout's emergence, no such renewal occurred. The great Deku tree remained dead, his protective influence fading with each passing season, like warmth, leaving a hearth whose fire has been extinguished, until the Kokiri found themselves orphaned in a world that no longer recognized their special status or provided the supernatural sustenance their immortal forms required. The death of their guardian created a crisis that went far beyond the immediate practical concerns of protection from monsters and maintenance of the forest's magical properties. Without the divine power that had sustained their eternal childhood, the Kokiri faced the gradual dissolution of everything that had defined their existence, their immunity to aging, their instinctive understanding of forest magic, their connection to the spiritual forces that governed the natural world, and most fundamentally, their sense of identity as being set apart from the ordinary concerns of mortal life. The physical changes that accompanied this spiritual transformation would have been subtle at first. A slight increase in height here, a new line of worry around the eyes there, the gradual development of concerns about food and shelter that had never troubled minds accustomed to having such needs met through supernatural providence. But as months turned to years, and the influence of their departed protector continued to fade, these changes would have accelerated until the eternally young forest children found themselves aging at the same rate as any other mortals in the kingdom. More profound than the physical transformation was the psychological adjustment required as minds that had never contemplated their own mortality suddenly found themselves confronted with the reality of limited time and finite possibility. Decisions that could once be postponed indefinitely because there would always be another century to reconsider now carried weight and urgency that had previously been alien concepts. Relationships that had been comfortable in their eternal casualness now demanded commitment and definition in the face of the knowledge that time together was precious because it was no longer unlimited. The evidence for this transformation lies scattered throughout the landscape of Twilight Princess, like pieces of a puzzle waiting for someone with sufficient patience and insight to recognize the pattern they form when properly assembled. The forest temple that Link explores in his quest to restore light to the Faron region bears unmistakable signs of Kokiri habitation, not merely the presence of their traditional symbols carved into ancient wood, but the architectural modifications that speak of a community that had made this place their home for an extended period. The temple itself, revealed through careful observation to be nothing less than the hollowed-out corpse of the great Deku tree, tells the story of a people who refused to abandon their connection to their departed guardian, even after his death had released them from their obligations to forest service. Rather than fleeing to distant lands where they might start fresh with new identities unburdened by the weight of their supernatural origins, the Kokiri chose to make their home within the very body of the being who had shaped their existence, creating a dwelling place that honored their history while acknowledging the reality of their changed circumstances. The internal chambers of this wooden cathedral, with their complex mechanical puzzles and guardian creatures, represent the Kokiri's attempt to preserve something of their old way of life while adapting to the practical requirements of their new mortality. The spinning platforms and rotating bridges that characterize the temple's interior architecture speak to minds that still thought in terms of three-dimensional forest canopies, but now needed to create permanent structures rather than relying on the living wood that had once shaped itself to their needs at the great Deku tree's command. Yet even this sanctuary eventually proved insufficient to protect them from the spreading corruption that followed in the wake of Twilight's invasion of the Realm of Light. The monsters that overran the forest temple, transforming its sacred chambers into lairs of shadow and malice, forced the final evacuation of the Kokiri from their ancestral homeland and drove them to seek refuge in regions where their past would not mark them as targets for the forces of darkness. The village of Auden, nestled peacefully in the foothills where forest gives way to farmland, represents the culmination of this long journey from supernatural guardianship to ordinary mortality. Here, far enough from their former home to avoid the attention of those who might remember their origins, close enough to maintain some connection to the woodlands that had shaped their earliest memories. The former children of the forest established new lives based on principles they had learned through bitter necessity rather than inherited through divine blessing. The physical evidence for this transformation lies not in dramatic monuments or obvious artifacts, but in subtle details that reveal themselves only to those who understand what to look for in the faces and forms of people whose ancestry stretches back to realms beyond ordinary human experience. The rounded ears that distinguish the Ordonians from the pointed-eared Hylians who populate most of the kingdom speak to a heritage that predates the physiological markers that typically denote descent from the goddess's favored people. This difference in ear shape, far from being merely cosmetic, represents a fundamental distinction in the relationship between mortal beings and the divine forces that govern their world. The pointed ears that mark true Hylians as children of the goddess Hylia serve as physical manifestations of their spiritual connection to the sacred powers that flow through the royal bloodline and express themselves in various forms of magical sensitivity. The rounded ears of the Ordonians, by contrast, speak to origins that lie outside this lineage entirely, in realms where different forms of divine influence shaped the development of sentient life. The Kokiri's original nature, as extensions of the great Deku Tree's consciousness, rather than independent creations of the goddess, would naturally have resulted in physical forms that reflected their unique spiritual heritage, and the persistence of these characteristics in their mortal descendants provides strong evidence for the continuity of bloodline, despite the dramatic changes in their essential nature and living circumstances. Further evidence appears in the names that connect the present inhabitants of Auden to the legendary figures of Kokiri folklore, most notably in the person of Fado, whose name echoes that of a famous Kokiri individual who appeared in multiple eras of Hyrule's history. This is not mere coincidence, but the kind of deliberate preservation of identity that occurs when a people wish to maintain connection to their heritage while adapting to changed circumstances that make open acknowledgement of their origins inadvisable. The presence of Kokiri symbols throughout the forest temple, combined with the temple's location in woods that were once known as the Kokiri Forest according to ancient texts, creates a clear trail of evidence that links the mysterious disappearance of the forest children to the emergence of a new community of mortals whose characteristics and location suggest a direct relationship between the two populations. The transformation from Kokiri to Ordonian represents more than mere biological evolution or cultural adaptation. It embodies one of the most profound philosophical questions that can be posed about the nature of identity and continuity in the face of fundamental change. Are the villagers of Auden the same beings who once danced in fairy rings beneath the great Deku Tree's protective branches? Or are they entirely new individuals who happen to share some physical characteristics and geographical preferences with their legendary predecessors? The answer lies perhaps not in choosing between these alternatives, but in recognizing that identity itself is more fluid and complex than simple binary classifications can adequately describe. The Ordonians are both the same and different from the Kokiri, carrying within their mortal forms the memories and instincts of their immortal ancestors while developing new capabilities and perspectives that their eternal childhood could never have encompassed. Their mastery of agricultural techniques that allow them to thrive in environments that would have been alien to their forest-dwelling predecessors speaks to adaptability, born from necessity, but guided by wisdom, inherited from generations of symbiotic relationship with the natural world. Their ability to find contentment in the rhythms of planting and harvest, birth and death, celebration and mourning, demonstrates that the loss of immortality need not mean the loss of meaning or purpose in existence. The courage they display, when faced with the threat of Bulblin raids and other dangers that periodically disturb their peaceful village life, reflects not the supernatural fearlessness of beings who knew themselves to be under divine protection, but the more complex bravery of mortals who understand the reality of loss and choose to risk everything they hold dear in defense of principles and people they value more than their own safety. In this transformation from eternal children to mortal adults, from supernatural forest guardians to ordinary village farmers, we see reflected one of the great themes that runs through all of Hyrule's history. The idea that meaning and purpose do not depend upon magical power or divine favor, but can be found by any beings willing to commit themselves to the welfare of others and the preservation of the values that make existence worth defending. The Ordonians may have lost their fairy companions and their immunity to aging, their instinctive understanding of forest magic, and their direct connection to the consciousness of an ancient tree spirit. But they have gained something that their immortal predecessors could never have possessed: the knowledge that their time together is precious precisely because it is limited, that their choices matter because they cannot be indefinitely postponed, and that their love for each other carries weight because it is freely given despite the certainty of eventual separation. As we contemplate this quiet transformation from legend to life, from supernatural to mundane, we might find in it not cause for mourning the loss of magic, but reason to celebrate the emergence of a different kind of wonder. The miracle of ordinary people choosing to build meaningful lives in the face of mortality, the everyday heroism of parents raising children and farmers tending crops and neighbors helping neighbors, all while knowing that their individual stories will end, but trusting that the values they embody and the love they share will somehow continue in forms they may never live to see. Act 8. The echoes of ancient wisdom. In the vast cathedral of time, where the voices of ancient civilizations still whisper their secrets to those who possess the patience to listen, there flows an undercurrent of knowledge so profound and persistent that it transcends the rise and fall of individual kingdoms, the birth and death of heroes, and even the fundamental restructuring of reality itself through divine intervention. This is the legacy of the Sheikah, those shadow folk whose understanding of the cosmic forces that govern existence runs deeper than the roots of the oldest trees, and whose influence continues to shape events across multiple timelines with the subtle persistence of water wearing away stone. The Sheikah's mastery of what they called the flow of time was never merely technological achievement or mystical understanding in isolation, but represented a synthesis of science and spirituality so complete that the distinction between the two became meaningless in the face of their accomplishments. Their shrines, scattered across the landscape of Hyrule like nodes in some vast network of accumulated wisdom, served not simply as repositories of ancient knowledge, but as active participants in the unfolding of destiny itself, their trials and treasures calibrated with mathematical precision to provide exactly the guidance and resources that future heroes would require at precisely the moments when such assistance would prove most crucial. The genius of their approach lay not in attempting to control the future through brute force or direct manipulation, but in understanding the patterns that govern how heroic narratives unfold across the centuries, recognizing that while the specific details might vary from one age to another, the fundamental challenges faced by champions of light remain remarkably consistent throughout the turning of ages. A hero will always need to prove their courage, develop their wisdom, accumulate power sufficient to face the forces of darkness, and ultimately choose sacrifice over self-preservation when the fate of others hangs in the balance. This understanding allowed the ancient Sheikah to create systems that could adapt to changing circumstances while maintaining their essential purpose, like rivers that carve new channels when their old paths are blocked, but never cease their journey toward the sea. The Sheikah slate, that miraculous device which serves as key to so many ancient mysteries, exemplifies this principle through its ability to interface seamlessly with technologies separated by 10,000 years of development, suggesting that its creators understood not just the immediate requirements of their own era, but the fundamental principles that would govern technological advancement across millennia. The implications of such foresight extend far beyond mere engineering prowess into realms of philosophical speculation that challenge our understanding of causality itself. How does one design a tool that will be needed by heroes who have not yet been born, in circumstances that have not yet arisen, to face challenges that exist only as potential threats in the abstract mathematics of probability? The answer lies in the Sheikah's recognition that beneath the surface chaos of individual events, there exist deeper patterns that repeat with the reliability of celestial mechanics. These patterns manifest not just in the grand cycles of heroism and corruption that define Hyrule's major historical epochs, but in the smaller rhythms of daily existence that connect ordinary mortals to the cosmic forces that shape their destinies. The placement of ancient shrines near natural landmarks that would remain recognizable across geological ages, the design of puzzles that test universal virtues rather than culture-specific knowledge, the creation of rewards that enhance fundamental capabilities rather than temporary advantages. All of these choices reflect understanding of principles that transcend the immediate concerns of any particular civilization. Yet perhaps the most remarkable aspect of Sheikah wisdom lies not in their ability to predict future needs, but in their understanding of how knowledge itself propagates through time, passing from master to student, from generation to generation, from one incarnation of eternal spirits to the next, through mechanisms that operate below the threshold of conscious awareness. The hidden techniques that the hero's shade teaches to the hero of twilight, the instinctive understanding that allows Link to operate ancient Sheikah technology despite having no formal training in its use, the way Princess Zelda's sacred powers manifest at moments of greatest need. All of these phenomena suggest the existence of information transfer systems that function independently of normal educational processes. This deeper form of knowledge transmission explains how civilizations separated by vast gulfs of time and circumstance can nevertheless build upon each other's achievements with the seamless continuity of a conversation carried on. Across millennia, the Royal Guard's attempts to recreate the Master Sword using Sheikah technology, the sage's success in crafting a functional replacement for the original blade in the adult timeline, the gradual rediscovery of ancient shrines when their activation becomes necessary for the kingdom's survival. All of these developments represent not random coincidence, but the natural unfolding of wisdom seeds planted by minds that understood how intellectual heritage moves through the world, like underground streams that surface when conditions become favorable for their emergence. The sacred locations that appear throughout Hyrule's geography provide another lens through which to examine the persistence of ancient wisdom across temporal boundaries. The Temple of Time maintains its essential function as a gateway between past and future, regardless of which timeline houses it, whether it stands in the heart of Castletown or hidden within the depths of a sacred grove. The springs of power, wisdom, and courage continue to serve as focal points for divine communion despite the dramatic changes in political and social structures that surround them across the ages. These enduring sites suggest that the Sheikah's understanding of sacred geography went beyond mere architectural planning into recognition of how spiritual energy moves through the physical world according to laws as reliable as those governing water flow or wind patterns. By aligning their most important constructions with these invisible currents of divine force, they ensured that their creations would remain potent and relevant regardless of what surface changes might occur in the civilizations that inherited their legacy. The recurring names that echo through Hyrule's history, the Impas who serve the royal family across multiple generations, the Links who bear the hero's spirit in age after age, the Zeldas whose wisdom guides the kingdom through crisis after crisis, represent more than mere coincidence or authorial convenience, but point toward the Sheikah's understanding of how identity itself persists across incarnations. Their recognition that certain spiritual essences repeatedly manifest in physical form allowed them to design systems that could recognize and respond to these eternal archetypes regardless of the specific historical context in which they appeared. This cyclical understanding of heroic identity explains the seemingly impossible precision with which ancient Sheikah preparations align with the needs of heroes born millennia after their creators' deaths. The trials within their shrines test not arbitrary skills, but the specific virtues that these recurring spiritual essences must develop to fulfill their cosmic roles. The rewards they offer enhance not random capabilities, but the precise abilities that experience has shown to be most crucial for success in the eternal struggle between light and darkness. Yet this cosmic perspective never led the Sheikah to fatalistic acceptance of predetermined outcomes, but rather to a deeper appreciation of how individual choices operate within broader patterns of possibility. Their technology enhances, rather than replaces, human agency, providing tools that amplify the effectiveness of courage and wisdom while never substituting mechanical solutions for the moral decisions that define heroic character. The Sheikah towers that rise from the earth at Link's command in Breath of the Wild exemplify this philosophy through their function as observation points rather than weapons or fortresses. They provide perspective and information, the raw materials of informed decision-making, while leaving the actual choices entirely in the hands of those who climb to their peaks. This reflects the ancient Sheikah's understanding that true wisdom lies not in controlling outcomes, but in ensuring that those who shape the future have access to the knowledge they need to choose well. The malice that corrupts Sheikah technology, when exposed to concentrated evil, represents not a failure of their engineering, but recognition of a fundamental truth about the relationship between tools and intentions. No technology, however advanced or well-intentioned in its creation, can remain immune to perversion if exposed to sufficient corruption. The ancient Sheikah built this vulnerability into their systems deliberately, ensuring that their most powerful creations could never be permanently turned against the forces of light, because they would always retain the capacity to remember their original purpose when touched by pure intention. This principle manifests most clearly in the way corrupted guardians immediately return to their protective function when cleansed of malice, and in the manner by which divine beasts resume their intended roles as champions of their respective peoples once freed from the blight Ganons that had seized control of their systems. The original programming never disappears but merely lies dormant, waiting for the restoration of conditions that allow it to express itself once again. The philosophical implications of such design choices extend into questions about the nature of good and evil themselves, suggesting that the ancient Sheikah understood corruption not as a permanent transformation but as a temporary obscuring of essential nature that could always be reversed through sufficient application of purifying force. This optimistic view of moral reality, the belief that no being or creation is irredeemably lost as long as some spark of original purpose remains intact, may represent their greatest contribution to the cosmic struggle between light and darkness. In recognizing this principle, the ancient Sheikah aligned themselves with the deepest currents of divine will, which consistently demonstrates throughout Hyrule's history a preference for redemption over destruction, transformation or elimination, the restoration of corrupted things to their intended purpose, rather than their replacement with entirely new creations. Even Ganondorf himself, the ultimate embodiment of cosmic evil, represents not pure malice, but the corruption of what was once noble purpose, the desire to provide for his people and secure their place in a world that had relegated them to into barren wastelands. The enduring influence of Sheikah wisdom thus operates not through the imposition of their will upon subsequent ages, but through their recognition and enhancement of the moral patterns that govern how good and evil interact across time. Their technology serves not as replacement for heroic virtue, but as amplification of virtues that heroes develop through their own choices and struggles, their understanding deepening rather than displacing the natural processes through which individuals grow into the roles that destiny has prepared for them. As we contemplate the subtle persistence of their influence across the vast spans of Hyrule's history, we begin to understand that the ancient Sheikah's greatest achievement was not any particular device or structure they created, but their recognition of how wisdom itself moves through the world, like seed carried on the wind, taking root wherever it finds soil prepared to nourish it, growing into forms that honor its essential nature, while adapting to the specific conditions of its new environment. In this understanding, we find not just appreciation for their remarkable accomplishments, but insight into how our own choices and creations might serve purposes that extend far beyond our ability to predict or control, becoming part of streams of influence that flow through time like rivers, carrying the accumulated gifts of all who have ever contributed to their current, bearing these offerings toward futures we can barely imagine, but somehow serve through the simple act of choosing wisdom over ignorance, compassion over cruelty, hope over despair. Act 9. The threads that bind. In the vast loom of existence where individual lives become threads in tapestries of meaning that extend far beyond the comprehension of any single weaver, there operates a principle so fundamental to the nature of reality that it shapes not only the grand narratives of kingdoms and heroes, but the smallest moments of choice and consequence that define the daily experience of every soul who walks beneath the light of sun and stars. This is the mystery of interconnected destiny, the way in which actions taken by one person in one moment ripple outward through time and space to influence events and individuals who may never know the name of the one whose choices shaped their fate. The bloodlines that carry heroic potential across the generations represent more than mere genetic inheritance or cultural tradition, but embody the physical manifestation of spiritual truths that operate according to laws deeper than biology or sociology can adequately explain. When we trace the lineage that connects the hero of time to the hero of twilight, we are following not just the passage of DNA from parent to child, but the flow of something more essential, a spiritual essence that transcends individual mortality while expressing itself through the specific circumstances and challenges of each historical moment in which it manifests. This essence does not simply lie dormant within bloodlines, waiting for the proper moment to emerge, but actively influences the choices and circumstances of each generation, subtly guiding the descendants of heroes towards situations where their inherited potential can be awakened and directed toward purposes that serve the greater cosmic balance between light and darkness. The son of a legendary champion may never know of his heritage, yet find himself drawn to acts of courage that echo his ancestors' deeds. The daughter of a sage may never hear the songs of ancient wisdom, yet discover within herself the capacity to heal wounds and mend broken spirits in ways that channel the same divine energies her forebear once commanded. The mechanism by which these inherited essences recognize when their time has come to manifest fully remains one of the deepest mysteries in all of Hyrule's extensive catalogue of metaphysical phenomena. The Master Sword's ability to identify and respond to the presence of the hero's spirit suggests that heroic potential carries with it certain measurable qualities that divine artifacts can detect and evaluate. Yet the nature of these qualities transcends simple moral virtue or combat prowess to encompass something more fundamental about the relationship between individual will and cosmic purpose. Perhaps what the sword recognizes is not any specific trait or ability, but rather a particular orientation of the soul, a willingness to place the welfare of others above personal safety, to accept responsibility for outcomes beyond one's direct control, to persist in the face of apparently hopeless odds, because the cause being served is more important than the likelihood of success. These qualities, when present in sufficient concentration and purity, create a resonance with the divine forces that shape the blade, allowing it to respond to its destined wielder, despite the passage of centuries or millennia since their last encounter. The recurring pattern of love that transcends individual lifetimes adds another layer of complexity to these interconnected destinies, suggesting that emotional bonds can persist across incarnations with the same reliability as heroic potential or royal bloodlines. The connection between Link and Zelda, played out again and again across different eras and circumstances, represents more than mere narrative convention, but points toward the existence of soul-level partnerships that survive the dissolution of physical forms and the reorganization of temporal reality itself. This eternal bond manifests differently in each incarnation, sometimes as romantic love, sometimes as deep friendship, sometimes as the complex relationship between sworn protector and beloved charge, yet always retains certain essential characteristics that mark it as the same fundamental connection, expressing itself through the filter of different personalities and cultural contexts. The hero of the sky's tender relationship with his Zelda, the hero of time's complicated dynamic with the princess he both served and challenged, the hero of Twilight's growing understanding of the royal heir. He was duty-bound to protect all represent facets of the same multi-dimensional bond, refracting through the prism of individual circumstances. The tragedy that often accompanies these relationships. The hero of time's separation from Saria, the hero of the sky's brief loss of his beloved to divine transformation. The eternal waiting that characterizes so many of their partings and reunions speaks to the price that must be paid when mortal hearts become vessels for immortal connections. The love that survives death and transcends time carries with it responsibilities that can overwhelm individual desires and transform personal happiness into cosmic service, creating relationships that are simultaneously more meaningful and more painful than ordinary human attachments. Yet within this pattern of sacrifice and separation, there exists also the promise of reunion that extends beyond any single lifetime or timeline, the assurance that connections forged at the level of essential being cannot be permanently severed by the temporary inconveniences of death, corruption, or the reconstruction of reality itself. Each parting becomes not an ending, but a pause in a conversation that will resume when circumstances once again align to allow their continuation, each loss balanced by the certainty of eventual restoration, in forms that may be different but remain fundamentally true to the original bond. The role of free will within these patterns of inherited destiny presents one of the most challenging philosophical puzzles in all of Hyrule's accumulated wisdom. If heroic potential passes through bloodlines like a torch carried from one generation to the next, and if the specific challenges each hero must face are determined by cosmic cycles that operate beyond mortal influence, then what genuine choice remains available to the individuals who find themselves cast in these eternal roles? The answer lies perhaps in the recognition that destiny operates not through the elimination of choice, but through its multiplication and amplification. The hero inherits not a script to be followed, but a capacity for meaningful action in circumstances where such capacity is desperately needed. The specific ways in which this potential manifests, the strategies chosen, the allies recruited, the sacrifices made, The moments of mercy or justice that define the character of each heroic legend remain entirely within the realm of individual decision, subject to all the complexity and uncertainty that characterizes genuine moral choice. The Triforce itself embodies this principle through its division into three aspects that must be balanced and integrated to achieve its full potential. Power without wisdom becomes tyranny. Wisdom without courage becomes paralysis. Courage without power becomes martyrdom. Yet when all three exist in proper proportion and alignment, they create possibilities that transcend the limitations of any individual component. The heroes who successfully unite these forces do so not by suppressing their individual nature, but by developing it so fully that it naturally harmonizes with the cosmic purposes it was designed to serve. The villains who appear again and again across the ages represent the shadow side of this same principle, demonstrating how inherited potential can be perverted when it becomes separated from the moral framework that gives it constructive purpose. Ganondorf's recurring manifestations across multiple timelines suggest that he too carries within himself something that transcends individual mortality, yet his essence has become so corrupted by hatred and ambition that each new incarnation represents not growth or development, but repetition of the same fundamental errors, dressed in different historical circumstances. The tragedy of his repeated defeats lies not simply in the failure of his schemes, but in the waste of potential that his corruption represents. The drive and intelligence that could have made him a great leader of his people, the strategic brilliance that could have solved the genuine problems facing the Gerudo, the sheer force of will that could have created lasting positive change. All of these gifts become weapons turned against the very world they could have helped to heal, creating cycles of conflict that benefit no one and enrich nothing except the appetite for destruction that feeds on its own success. Yet even in his corruption, Ganondorf serves an essential function within the cosmic balance, providing the opposition that heroic potential requires for its full development and expression. Without genuine challenges that test courage, wisdom, and power to their limits, these virtues remain theoretical abstractions rather than practical realities, forged in the crucible of meaningful choice. The villain who poses a true threat to everything the hero holds dear creates the circumstances in which theoretical virtue can become actual heroism, potential can become achievement, and inherited capacity can become earned wisdom. The persistence of certain locations across multiple timelines and incarnations speaks to another aspect of interconnected destiny, the way in which geographic features can become repositories of accumulated meaning that transcends their immediate physical properties. The Temple of Time remains a gateway between past and future, regardless of its specific architectural form or precise location, because its essential function has become so deeply embedded in the spiritual geography of Hyrule that it can manifest wherever and whenever such a gateway is needed. Death Mountain serves as a symbol of enduring strength and forge fire transformation in timeline after timeline, not because the mountain itself possesses consciousness or will, but because the repeated association of this place with these concepts has created resonances that persist across temporal boundaries and influence the events that occur within its shadow. The Gorons who make their home on its slopes, the master sword that is sometimes forged or reforged in its fires, the trials that heroes undergo in its depths, all of these elements align with the essential character that this location has acquired through its role in countless heroic narratives. The wisdom traditions that survive the collapse of civilizations and the passage of ages demonstrate how intellectual and spiritual inheritance can persist, even when the institutional structures that originally preserved it have crumbled into dust. the songs that carry forward the knowledge of ancient sages, the stories that preserve the strategies that once defeated terrible evils, the prophecies that prepare future generations for the return of long-dormant threats. All of these represent forms of cultural DNA that reproduce themselves through the simple act of being passed from teacher to student, parent to child, friend to friend. This informal transmission of essential knowledge explains how heroes separated by vast gulfs of time can nevertheless learn techniques and access wisdom that properly belongs to entirely different eras and cultures. The hidden skills that the hero's shade teaches to the hero of twilight, the ancient songs that Link somehow knows how to play, despite having no formal musical education, the instinctive understanding that allows Zelda to access powers she has never been trained to use. All of these phenomena point toward the existence of knowledge-sharing mechanisms that operate below the threshold of conscious awareness, yet remain perfectly reliable in their function. The true mystery lies not in how these connections persist across time and space, but in why they remain selective rather than universal, why some individuals become conduits for ancient wisdom, while others remain untouched by such inheritance, despite equal apparent worthiness or need. The answer may lie in the same resonance principles that govern the Master Sword's responsiveness to heroic potential, that certain souls carry within themselves the capacity to receive and channel specific forms of wisdom because their essential nature aligns with the spiritual frequencies through which such wisdom propagates itself. As we contemplate these vast networks of connection that link hero to hero, sage to sage, victim to savior across the endless turning of ages, we begin to understand that individual identity, while precious and irreplaceable, represents only the most immediately visible aspect of something far grander and more enduring. We are all simultaneously unique expressions of divine creativity and participants in patterns of meaning that extend far beyond our individual comprehension, actors in stories whose full significance can only be appreciated from perspectives that encompass multiple lifetimes and timelines. This understanding brings with it both humility and empowerment. Humility in the recognition of how small our individual contributions appear when measured against the cosmic scope of the forces we serve. Empowerment in the knowledge that even our smallest choices participate in the weaving of tapestries, whose beauty and meaning will endure long after our individual threads have fulfilled their purpose and been integrated into patterns we could never have envisioned when our part in their creation first began. Act 10. The infinite tapestry. In the final chamber of understanding where all questions converge, like streams flowing toward an ocean of infinite depth, we find ourselves confronting truths so vast and encompassing that they challenge the very foundations of how we distinguish between what is real and what is merely possible, between what has been proven and what can only be contemplated, between the solid ground of established fact and the shifting sands of speculation that may nevertheless support structures of meaning, more enduring than any monument carved from stone. The theories we have explored together in this journey through the hidden chambers of Hyrule's mysteries represent far more than idle speculation or creative interpretation of ambiguous evidence. They embody the fundamental human impulse to seek pattern and meaning in the apparent chaos of existence, to construct bridges of understanding that span the gaps between isolated facts and connect them into narratives that satisfy both intellectual curiosity and emotional need for coherence in a universe that often seems determined to resist our attempts to comprehend its deeper purposes. Each theory we have contemplated, whether concerning the nature of duplicate master swords or the transformation of forest children into mortal villagers, the mechanics of power shared and withdrawn, or the abandoned timelines that continue their lonely existence beyond the reach of heroic intervention, serves as a lens through which we can examine not just the fictional universe of Hyrule, but the actual world in which we live, with its own mysteries of causation and connection, its own patterns of recurrence and transformation, its own questions about the relationship between individual choice and larger forces that shape the contexts within which such choices must be made. The beauty of these speculative constructs lies not in their provability but in their capacity to generate new ways of seeing familiar elements, to reveal hidden connections that enrich our appreciation of complexity while never claiming to have solved the ultimate mysteries they illuminate. Like the ancient Sheikah whose wisdom operated through suggestion rather than compulsion, through the provision of tools rather than the dictation of outcomes, these theories serve best when they enhance, rather than replace our own capacity for wonder and discovery. The relationship between fan speculation and official canon represents one of the most fascinating aspects of how meaning propagates through communities of shared interest and imagination. The theories that emerge from careful observation of textual details and passionate discussion among devoted students of a fictional universe often demonstrate insights and connections that escape even the original creators, revealing layers of significance that were embedded in the work through the mysterious alchemy by which artistic creation transcends conscious intention. This phenomenon suggests that the boundary between author and audience, between official truth and interpretive possibility, may be far more porous than traditional models of textual authority would suggest. When thousands of minds engage deeply with a created world, examining its details with the intensity of scholars studying sacred texts, they participate in an ongoing process of collaborative meaning-making that extends and enriches the original work in ways that no individual imagination, however brilliant, could achieve in isolation. The creators of the Zelda universe, like all artists whose work achieves genuine cultural significance, have succeeded in constructing not just entertainment, but a mythology capable of supporting interpretive weight, far beyond anything they could have consciously planned or controlled. The symbols they embedded in their digital landscapes, the patterns they established in their narrative structures, the archetypal characters they brought to life through pixels and code, all of these elements have taken on independent existence in the collective imagination of their audience, generating meanings and connections that surprise even their originators. This collaborative relationship between creator and interpreter mirrors the way in which the ancient Sheikah embedded potential wisdom in their constructions, designing systems that would reveal their secrets only when approached by minds prepared to receive what they had to offer. The theories that resonate most strongly with devoted students of Hyrule's mysteries are those that feel like discoveries rather than inventions, revelations of connections that seem to have been waiting patiently for someone with sufficient insight and dedication to uncover them from their hiding places within the vast architecture of accumulated detail. Yet this process of discovery and interpretation must always maintain awareness of its own limitations and uncertainties, acknowledging the difference between what can be demonstrated and what can only be suggested, between patterns that reflect genuine design and those that emerge from the human tendency to project meaning onto random arrangements of data. The most valuable theories are those that remain conscious of their own speculative nature while still pursuing their insights with sufficient rigor to distinguish between possibilities that merit serious consideration and those that collapse under careful examination. The enduring appeal of mystery in narrative art speaks to something fundamental about the nature of human curiosity and the relationship between knowledge and satisfaction. Stories that answer every question and resolve every ambiguity, that leave no room for speculation or personal interpretation, often prove less engaging over time than those that preserve spaces for the imagination to explore, riddles that continue to reward contemplation long after their surface content has been thoroughly absorbed. The Zelda universe has achieved this quality of sustainable mystery, not through deliberate obscurity or arbitrary withholding of information, but through the creation of a world rich enough and complex enough to support multiple levels of meaning simultaneously. The same events can be read as straightforward adventure stories, as mythological allegories, as psychological explorations of growth and transformation, or as philosophical meditations on the nature of good and evil, time and eternity, individual agency and cosmic destiny. This multiplicity of interpretive possibilities reflects the way in which the greatest works of art operate simultaneously on multiple registers of meaning, offering something of value to audiences, approaching them from vastly different perspectives and levels of engagement. A child can enjoy the surface adventure of a hero's quest, while an adult finds deeper significance in the moral choices that define heroic character, and both experiences remain equally valid and mutually enriching rather than contradictory or competitive. The theories we have explored demonstrate how this interpretive richness functions in practice, showing how careful attention to detail can reveal connections and implications that casual observation might miss, while never claiming exclusive access to truth or demanding that others abandon their own ways of understanding the material. The best fan theories operate like good scholarship in any field, proposing hypotheses based on available evidence, acknowledging alternative explanations, and remaining open to revision in light of new information or better arguments. The social dimension of theory crafting adds another layer of significance to this process, creating communities of shared inquiry where individual insights can be tested, refined, and built upon through collaborative discussion. The excitement that accompanies the discovery of a compelling new interpretation, the satisfaction of finding evidence that supports a previously speculative connection, the friendly debates that arise when different theories compete for adherence. All of these experiences contribute to the formation of interpretive communities that extend the life and meaning of the original work far beyond its initial publication. These communities demonstrate how intellectual curiosity and creative imagination can flourish within structures of shared reference and common interest, how the combination of individual insight and collective discussion can generate understanding that exceeds what any participant could achieve alone. The theories that emerge from such collaborations often display a sophistication and comprehensiveness that rivals professional academic analysis, driven by passion and sustained engagement rather than institutional obligation or professional advancement. The preservation of mystery within narrative works serves not only aesthetic purposes but epistemological ones, maintaining spaces for uncertainty and speculation that reflect the fundamental incompleteness of human knowledge about even the most carefully studied subjects. The questions that remain unanswered in fictional universes mirror the mysteries that persist in actual existence, reminding us that wonder and curiosity remain appropriate responses to complexity that exceeds our current understanding. In this light, the theories we have contemplated together serve as exercises in a form of thinking that extends far beyond the realm of entertainment into the practical business of navigating real-world uncertainty with intellectual honesty and creative flexibility. The skills required to construct compelling interpretations from ambiguous evidence, to maintain multiple hypotheses simultaneously, while remaining open to new information, to distinguish between different levels of certainty without abandoning inquiry. When definitive proof proves elusive, all of these capabilities prove valuable in contexts that have nothing to do with fictional worlds or speculative narratives. The enduring fascination that these mysteries hold for devoted students of Hyrule's lore speaks to something deeper than mere entertainment or escapism. In exploring the hidden connections that link heroes across time, the subtle patterns that govern the relationship between technology and wisdom, the complex interplay between destiny and choice that shapes the lives of both legendary figures and ordinary people, we are really exploring questions that define our own existence as conscious beings, struggling to understand our place in patterns larger than ourselves. The comfort that many find in these contemplative journeys through speculative possibility may derive partly from their demonstration that meaning can emerge from careful attention to detail and patient consideration of alternatives, that understanding develops gradually through sustained engagement rather than arriving suddenly through dramatic revelation. In a world that often seems to reward quick judgments and superficial analysis, the slow process of theory development models a different approach to knowledge that honors complexity while maintaining hope that persistence will eventually yield insight. As we reach the conclusion of our journey through these interconnected mysteries, we carry with us not definitive answers, but enriched appreciation for the questions themselves, deeper awareness of the subtle patterns that connect apparent disparities, and renewed respect for the creative intelligence that can construct fictional worlds capable of supporting such sustained and rewarding exploration. The theories remain theories, possibilities rather than certainties, invitations to continue thinking, rather than declarations that thinking has reached its end. Yet in their very uncertainty lies their greatest gift, the reminder that reality, whether fictional or actual, contains depths that exceed any single perspective's ability to fathom completely, mysteries that reward investigation while never exhausting the wonder that drives such investigation forward into ever new territories of understanding and appreciation.